Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Hey Rockstars, it's Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, the show bringing you into the studio to learn from professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. 2 years ago today, I had an inspiration. I realized that I wanted to create a podcast that would allow me to share all the things that I had learned over 25 years of recording, share the network of great producers and engineers that I knew and was meeting all the time, and help you learn more about making a great record in the studio. So I decided to create a show called Recording Studio Rockstars. Why did I give it such an over-the-top name? Well, that one's easy. I knew that if I wanted to invite people onto the show, it made a lot of sense to have it clearly indicate that this was a compliment to them coming on the show. So I'm calling my guests a rock star of the studio, of course. And I also knew that if I was going to really help you make a great record in the studio, I was going to also need to have a name that paid you a compliment as the person who's learning and listening to this. Hence, you're the rock star. So that's where the name came from. That was how I got the idea to call this show Recording Studio Rockstars, if it wasn't obvious to you already. And I'm really excited because today's episode is episode 100 for Recording Studio Rockstars. That means that for 100 weeks, without ever missing an episode, I've been able to bring a new producer, a new engineer, a new musician, a new studio designer onto the podcast to share all their insights, things that they've learned about making records, and help both me and you learn more about recording in the studio. And in fact, one of the lessons that we've learned over these past 100 episodes, I think it was first introduced to us by Graham Cochran, comes from Ira Glass, who is the host of a show called This American Life. And Ira Glass has this quote that has been shared over and over again because it's brilliant. And it essentially says that when we first start out with something, we have developed a sense of taste. We've developed our ability to identify what we consider to be great work, whether it's in music, whether it's writing, whatever it is. But it's only through over and over again creating a large body of work ourselves that we ever finally develop our skill at creating a great work ourselves. So on the podcast, I took that lesson to mean, if you want to write better songs, at first you appreciate what a great song is, and that inspires you to write great songs, but it's only by writing over and over and over again that you finally write yourself a great song. Or if you're mixing and you're learning how to mix music, at first you maybe really appreciate what an inspiring, great record is. A mix that really just gets you super excited. You think it sounds fantastic. You know how to listen to it already, but it's only through the process of mixing it over and over and over again that you develop that ability yourself to create a great mix. Of course, the process of learning from experts too along the way is part of that process as well. Well, I had been listening to what I consider to be great podcasts when I started Recording Studio Rockstars. And I'm happy to say that now that I've done 100 episodes over 2 years, I feel like I've finally learned something about creating podcasts. And one of the ways that has been really a pleasure for me to see evidence of that is in the ways that the audience for the podcast, you, have grown and grown and grown over 100 episodes. To give you some perspective, for the first 50 episodes or so, there was sort of an initial burst of listens when the podcast launched and it was part of the new and noteworthy in iTunes. And then it just kind of stayed at a real steady state for many, many, many months. And then around July of last year in 2016, all of a sudden I started to see what you call a hockey stick growth in business, where when you look at the chart of the growth of the listeners on the podcast, it just sort of started angling up, and it's stayed fairly consistently at that new trajectory for the past year. So what was once really amazing to see that, there were 100 people listening to the very first episodes, maybe 200 people, now with 2 years and 100 episodes has grown into much larger numbers. So I'm incredibly honored and humbled that you're listening to this episode right now, and that so many of you have chosen to learn from Recording Studio Rockstars, learn from all the guests that we've had on the show, and even written into me, whether it's through email, whether it's, through social media or comments on YouTube, all the various places, and told me that, and let's not forget iTunes reviews. Thank you, all of you, so much for all the wonderful iTunes reviews. You have reached out and let me know that this has really helped you learn how to make a better record, and I get messages from people all the time that will tell me that, they've learned so much on the show that it has helped them finally get over the hump of finishing their first record, or just finishing a record that they really, really wanted to make. And that to me is incredible and really moving. I mean, I'm sort of a little bit at a loss for words right now to express how much that means to me. But I do just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for all the time that you've put in, whether you've discovered this podcast a long time ago, and like some of you have told me that you went back to episode 0 and binge listened all the way through, or whether you've discovered it more recently and you're just sort of playing a game of catch up and trying to listen in, or whether this is the first one you've landed on. I hope that this episode itself is very rewarding for you. The process of creating 100 episodes has shown me a growth of the podcast and a growth of the audience that we're all a part of here. And it's really inspiring. So what I thought I would do as a way of celebrating our journey on 100 episodes with Recording Studio Rockstars is to go back through and choose the top 10 downloaded and listened to episodes out of all 100. So these podcast episodes that I want to take you on a tour of are the top ones that you have shown me have been valuable to you, measured by how many downloads there are. Now, granted, measuring popularity of something is not exactly a perfect science. And so this is the best way that I could think of to reflect back on all the time that we've put in over 100 episodes in 2 years of creating this podcast. So thank you so much for listening and being here with me. And it's really just so cool for me to go back and listen to the very first episode, episode 0, where I explained who I am and how I got into music and how I got into recording. At the time, I was just thrilled if there were, 10 people, 20 people who downloaded the episode and gave it a listen, to taking you to right up to episode 100 now, where every month we're increasing as we go and getting as high as 46,000 downloads. We're almost at 50,000 downloads in a single month. So that's just magnificent. And that really just is a reflection of you, rock stars. So thank you again so much for listening. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And without any further ado, let's jump into episode 100 of Recording Studio Rockstars. All right, I am so excited to be able to say that coming in at number 10 is my good friend Björgvin Benediktsson from audioissues.com. Also, he's a member of my mastermind group every week. I've been hanging out with Björgvin for the last couple of years. Thrilled that he's made it right into the top 10. This comes from episode 76 with Björgvin Benediktsson, step-by-step mixing. We're going to jump right in. Thank you, Björgvin, for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. Björgvin starts out with a great quote about reverb selection, and then we jump right into one of our questions from the interview, where we talk about dialing in your kick drum in a mix, how to avoid ending up with a muddy kick drum or losing it all together when you start to EQ. Take it away, Björgvin.
If you want to be really lazy on your reverb selection, just find a reverb mode, maybe a hall or a room, depending on the genre and the feel of the song you want, and just put it on 10% wet on the master fader. It's a cheat, and it's a really lazy way of using reverb, but it's fast and efficient.
All right, cool. So this one, next question comes from Daryl. He says, I'm trying to mix down a song and I'm struggling with my kick drum. I can't seem to get this one. It either gets muddy trying to EQ or I lose it when I try to compress. I'm frustrated because this is the first time this has happened and I can't figure it out and I need to get the song done. Help, in all caps, exclamation point. I totally feel you, Daryl. I apologize that the time frame of your question and the answer may not be, I don't know how soon you need to get your mix done, but hopefully this will reach you in time.
Yeah, right. So I'm not entirely sure what he means, lose it. Does he lose the muddiness or whatnot? But just in general, muddiness for me is just sort of hunting down and hunting around in the low mids with, a frequency cut, trying to clean things up. And having a frequency analyzer can help if you don't really know, where muddiness should be, or you can't seem to find the frequency. Having an analyzer that shows you graphically where there's more buildup than in other areas, it's a good starting point to do that. I actually do have a report that's free that at audio-issues.com/fix muddy mixes. I have a 6-step sort of guide that gives you a bunch of tips and tricks on how to fix muddy mixes. But for compression, I don't know if does he mean lose it by like it compresses it too much and it doesn't.
That's what I'm guessing. I mean, we've got is the question written here, but I'm going to guess that it means that when you start compressing it, you lose it, and it makes sense because you're actually bringing the volume down. Right. So you would lose it in the mix. You'd have to sort of bring it back up, and you probably need to EQ it before compression. Maybe we should also throw out some places to look for those muddy frequencies. I think that I would say that if you're inside the kick drum, if it's something like what I use, a AKG D112, and you're inside the kick drum with your mic, that the muddy frequencies might be around 200, 250. And if you hertz, and if you really pull those back out, I mean, you might suck 12 dB out of your sound to get it to sound right. That'll make it sound a lot more like a modern, focused, tight sound.
Yep.
You gotta trust your ears. You don't want to overdo it. If you change the nature of the instrument, it's not, it's going to be a new thing. You got to like what you end up with. Yeah,
for sure.
But if you're outside the drum, if it's a front head mic, that's sort of more of a pillowy sound. And where would you say the pillowy stuff is to sort of pull back?
Well, I was thinking normally when I get a kick drum that kind of sounds like feels like it has a blanket over it. It is just like not muddy in that sort of way, but the sort of has that boominess. That's more like that's a lower frequency for me. I usually start hunting in 100 to 150.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was going to say too. So it kind of depends on what the sound is, but anywhere from 150 right up to 250 and 300 are probably great places to start sweeping a cut and just look for something that seems to tighten up the sound a lot.
For sure.
And then again, Daryl is, don't be afraid to make that a pretty big cut. Cutting 12 dB that's fine if it sounds better there. You might be only doing a tiny bit and then not hearing the results because you're not cutting enough. Although it's interesting that you say, Daryl says that it gets muddy trying to EQ. So it's probably, you're probably just trying to boost stuff and then that's making it worse,
Right.
I'd say that was my first error in trying to get kicks right is I thought, I'd hear something that had great low end to it. And so I'd go and I'd start boosting all the low end on my kick drums. And that will tend to make your kick drum sound really muddy. You a lot of times you want to cut out the bad stuff first and then start adding a little bit if you want.
Yeah, for sure. I tend to start by filtering out generally on a kick drum, maybe 32 hertz, just to get rid of all that like low rumble. And then I cut anywhere in the mids, especially getting rid of boxiness is a big problem, big issue. And then from there, if it's still kind of boomy or muddy, I'll try to clean up in the low end a bit more.
Yeah. So one last comment about the cutting the 32. You use the content, getting rid of the low rumble. I think what confused me, or what has confused me before, is thinking that rumble makes it sound like there's something I should be able to hear going on down there. And a lot of times where you're mixing, you don't really hear it so much as it's there and it's affecting everything else.
Yeah.
So Rockstars, try cutting some of those, sweep your cut up until you do hear it and go back and forth until you really get a feel for in where I'm mixing. This is where I begin to hear that cut, taking away something that I want in the kick drum versus I don't even hear what it's doing down low. And, if you're really not sure, split the difference, go a little bit extra into the territory where you're not hearing what it's doing, and then just stop there and know that you're getting rid of frequencies that you may not hear with your ears so much, but they are frequencies that are causing your speakers to move in and out while they're trying to reproduce all this other frequency in your mix. And that is the kind of stuff that sort of, steals a lot of energy from your mix and sort of hurts things down the line and causes distortion in the master stage and all that.
Right. I wanted to give him a couple of different tips for the compression part of his question. I don't know if you're losing it because it's like dying in the mix. Make sure your makeup gain is actually compensating for your compression, so it stays relatively the same volume. If you're losing the snap of the beater, so like the kick isn't kicking through the mix, make sure your attack isn't really fast, because if your attack is fast and you're compressing hard, it'll kind of eat up that initial transient, and it won't be as present in the mix. So tweaking the attack and release, and then trying to find the compression gain reduction that you want is probably is a good start.
Great tips, man. All right, Rockstars. Thanks again to Björgvin Benediktsson of audioissues.com. If you want to check out that full episode, just simply go to rsrockstars.com/76, and that'll take you to our episode where we talk all about Björgvin's book, Step-by-Step Mixing, links to which you'll find in the show notes. So thank you again, Björgvin. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, Rockstars, next up at number 9 is my good friend Bobby Holland from right here in Nashville, Tennessee. Great producer, great mixer. And we had a fantastic interview straight from his studio at Pentaveret Studios in Berry Hill. This one comes from episode number 79. He talks first about learning how to mix first before you worry about all the gear. And then we dive right into a question about how to create space and depth in a mix. So without any further ado, take it away, Bobby Holland.
I see people getting so caught up. In particular, it seems like mic pre's. Like if I just had this mic pre, then my records would sound good, which is absolutely untrue in my opinion. Or if I just had this summing mixer, then my mixes would finally sound great. Absolutely not true. Learn how to mix. Then if you want a summing mixer, buy one.
Here's another mixing question. This one is, how do you create space and depth in a mix?
Oh, man. Oh, low mids suck sometimes. So I find myself, I just commented on 250 on a kick drum, but one of the best ways I create clarity in a mix, I'll get to depth in a second, but space is carefully giving instruments their own space. And I find that some instruments, of course, depending on the timbre of the instrument, it will occupy its own frequency range. But when you get into miking different things and shoving dynamic mics up close to guitar amps, etc., you can kind of have some artificial things happen. So I find that there's a whole lot of bad stuff that happens in the low mid range, anywhere from 200 hertz to 700 hertz. And so I find that there's a lot of cutting going on across the board. Almost every track on my console will have a moderate to extreme cut in the mid-range. Wherever the instrument sounds like it's, getting mushy with something else, I'll find a range. If there's a guitar that's making it so you can't hear another guitar, I'll cut some mid-range out, or like...
And that would be like a bell curve cut, not necessarily a high pass cut.
A lot of times if a vocalist is talking way up close to a vocal mic or singing way up close to a vocal mic, the proximity effect will add a whole bunch of mushy, gross stuff in the low mids, which gets exacerbated with compression to some certain compressors. And like with kick drum and bass, you sometimes might have to figure out, is the bass gonna get the super mega subby low end, or is the kick drum? And same thing with the low mids. Like if it's an aggressive song and you want your kick drum to be real cutting and punchy, then that low mid range can really keep that from happening. By contrast, if it's kind of an Americana song or something a little more laid back, then that low mid range is really nice on a kick drum. It will add some maybe sort of a heartbeat kind of sound. I'm trying to think of an example. Acoustic guitar is a big thing. Probably the biggest thing I cut the low mids on as a general practice is I get terribly recorded acoustics a lot of the time where they have the mic way too close or right on the sound hole or something like that. And instead of adding a whole bunch of top end, I'll cut a whole bunch of low mids, because then the low end's right. Anyway, I find that generally I try to do more subtractive EQ than additive EQ.
Cool. That's a great answer.
So that's the space. And then as far as depth, I don't know, certain playing with reverbs, that's a big thing. Sometimes it's not always cool to have like a big splashy snare reverb. Sometimes I put a reverb on my whole drum kit, a really long, really long dark thing. If it's kind of not a lot of instrumentation in a track, I'll like stick a huge washy long reverb on something that is maybe more felt than heard, but it creates depth and it maybe makes a track sound a little bigger than it is.
Yeah. What about pre-delay? Is pre-delay a really important thing to know about when you're using reverbs?
As an effect, most of the time. Like I play with pre-delay a lot, actually. It's technically speaking, I guess there's no rule of thumb. Just like, does it sound cool?
What's a common little bit of pre-delay, and what number of milliseconds would equal more likely to be heard as an effect?
I don't know, a little bit of pre-delay, maybe like 20, 40 milliseconds, maybe not noticeable in that range, and you get up to exceeding 100 milliseconds. I guess it kind of depends on what reverb you're using too.
Right.
But exceeding 100 milliseconds, like I love something you can't necessarily do with hardware spring reverb, but I love putting pre-delay on plug-in spring reverbs. It can sound like a slapback and a reverb all at the same time.
Cool.
And so that's a really fun trick.
Nice. Awesome, man. We got a great trick out of you. Thanks so much, Bobby. You rock. Rockstars, if you want to go check out that episode directly, just go to rsrockstars.com/79 and you can go listen to the full episode with Bobby Holland. Okay, for the next one, we've got at number 8, episode 86 with Jesse Cannon, where he tells us about his book, Processing Creativity. We talk about following your heart in mixing, and Jesse discusses why it's always good to try and have a unique tone on every song, and the importance of dividing your creative tasks from your emotional tasks during the day in the studio. He's also going to share an important app that might help you out. Take it away, Jesse.
What makes good production is like listening to the emotion. Like if you compress a vocal on an Elliott Smith song the way you do a Rancid song, it doesn't work. The heart listens to things and says, I need more of this. And then you turn knobs and EQ and compress and saturate and do change levels until you get that emotional reaction that you know the song can have.
So you said that it's one of the secrets you like to do, are rules for the studio, where you create them for yourself. You said always try and have a unique tone on every song, something that like sounds like it's only on that song, which I thought that was a cool idea too.
Yeah, I stole that from I think I've stolen that from 5 of people I respect that I've probably heard on various podcasts or read in interviews over the years. And I do think that that's something like I've found also resonates with me, is that those are my favorite songs, always have that one thing. But like with the making the music you love, like the other big habit that like I try to get some of the musicians I work with continuously over the years in is like when you're feeling an emotion, you know, what we have to do is, you know, a lot of the beginning of the book discusses the thing that a lot of people think they imitate, or I like to there's a concept in creativity they like to call idea sex. So Reese's peanut butter cups, chocolate, peanut butter. Oh, look at that.
Right.
That's not how good music is made. A lot of people think if I just throw these two things together, it's going to make good music. What makes good music is emotional reactions and tying things together. Like,
yeah.
Everybody I've ever watched that makes great music keeps reacting and reacting and reacting and saying, what does the sound I'm hearing inspire? That's an emotion I'm feeling inside me. And then as well, on the other side of that is if like you're a songwriter, that a lot of time you have to go in and say, you know, like you have to get in a habit that when you feel pain or you feel something you want to express, to get that out and then retain it, and have the good habit to also remember to hit record on your iPhone if you're not around a DAW or something, and get really good with that type of stuff. That's a good amount of it for songwriters. But I even have like habit as producer that like I often even like today I'm mixing a song from somebody from a band that I've worked with for years. I love these songs. And I know that if I go in to do my mastering for the day, where I might not be as emotionally attached to it, it's going to kind of drag me down because none of us like having to fix problems and stuff like that. So I know early in the day, I have to work on what's going to need emotion for me. So this mix is going to need me to zone into like how this song makes me feel in fine tones. Whereas like the mastering I'm going to do today is largely going to be the thing of like EQing out where the honkiness in the vocal is and figuring out how the multiband moves right. Not very emotional things, and figuring out how you put that into your life is so crucial.
Well, so how do you put that into your life? I mean, I would equate that to some of the things you learn about your own process, where you might say, there are some tasks that I'm going to do that need a very clear head. So I'm going to put those ones in the morning and make those the first things I do in the day. And there are some tasks that are maybe more repetitive, and I can do those in the afternoon, you know, post-lunch sleepiness. And then maybe there are some things that are good at night. You know, maybe my voice sings well at night. But how do you tie those together? How do you separate your creative tasks from the ones that are less emotional?
So you just hit like a really good thing, is that you and I are totally the opposite in this, is that my brain doesn't work in the morning. So I do all my creative work around 6 p.m. to 11 because I've observed that that's the best time for me.
Interesting, yeah.
I know I'm in the minority on that, but there is a good amount of us who have like that weird thing. And so what I do is I have an app called OmniFocus, which is a to-do app based on David Allen's Getting Things Done. That really like, yeah. So you're one of the smart, efficient few.
You know, I tried it though. I never actually could adopt it, but my brother, he adopted it and used it for a while. And I do subscribe to the David Allen philosophy that says, if you've got something to do and you think you can get it done in 2 minutes, do it now. Yes,
that's a life changer. But so what I do when I have a long commute every day, and it's all riding my bike and walking, and so I like just look at that OmniFocus and I put my day in order of what I think is going to hit the best things for getting everybody I'm working for to get the best outcome. And a lot of that stuff is like, it's that thing of like, it's like I want to have the emotional reaction stuff early in the day, whereas I'm much more analytical later at night. And so if it is going to be setting that multi-band compressor to get rid of the I know that that's a little bit better later in the day for me.
Yeah.
So I think it's learning who you are. And I talk a lot about this in the book, is that the reason you can't say like, there's a lot of people who like will read the creative process of who they respect or see that person does a certain drug. And it's like, the things we have to all remember is that like we all have different chemicals inside us that make up different things. You can see that Slash plays a Les Paul and say, I want tone more like Slash. I'll play a Les Paul and a Marshall, and it might get you a little closer, but you can't do that with saying, well, Slash used to drink that bottle of Jack Daniels every day. That might not be right for you because of what your brain chemicals are.
Right. All right. Thank you so much, Jesse Cannon, for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. Rockstars, if you want to check out that episode, the full one, just go to rsrockstars.com/86. and you can go check that out. And don't forget, in the show notes, we'll include a link to Jesse's book, Processing Creativity. All right, next up, Rockstars, is number 7. And this comes from episode 92 with Alan Douches, Preparing Your Mixes for Mastering. So Alan is a great mastering engineer with tons of experience. He's done a lot of really cool indie rock records like Sufjan Stevens and Animal Collective. He tells us about that on the episode. But in this particular sample I'm going to share with you, I dig into a bit of a perplexing question, and I ask Alan to explain to us exactly what is an ISRC code and why in the world do we need it. So Alan's going to explain all this to us. If you want to check out the whole thing, go to rsrockstars.com/92, and you'll see the show notes. I'm also going to include a link in there, a special link, which I made for you, rsrockstars.com/metadata. And that actually is a link you can use to go download a free worksheet, which will give you an explainer of ISRC codes and other items that you're going to need to get from your artists when it's time to finish the record and master. So go check that out. Meanwhile, take it away, Alan Douches. Thanks so much for being on Recording Studio Rockstars. Cheers.
I kind of grew up in the industry, listening to the playback of a Studer A80 half-inch playing back through a Neve console, through big JBL bi-radial monitors, and it just sounded awesome. And you always want to try to get back to that. Don't necessarily compare your music to, the latest, greatest, pop record that's squashed down to an MP3. You want it to be dynamic.
All right, so let's jump to another question that comes up in mastering. What do we need to know about the stuff that we don't hear? In other words, tell us about metadata. What are those weirdo codes that we're supposed to have in there so that what are we going to not make money with our song?
ISRCs. The interesting thing is that, especially from an MP3 standpoint, everybody can download a free MP3 tag editor. You should be putting as much information in the notes section as I would put your entire lyrics in the notes section. Because if anybody's searching the internet and wants to find, hey, I want to find a song about Marilyn Monroe. Whatever, it's her birthday coming up. I don't want to, radio station wants to play something. They do a search. If it's not in your metadata, how are they going to find it? If it's not the title of your song, how are they going to find it? Load that metadata up with everything you can so that it's searchable. The band name, the artist, maybe the writers, lyrics, a story along with it. You'd be surprised what the search engines will find, and then you show up for that.
So when and where do we do that? Is that something we do before we deliver to you for mastering, or does that happen later?
Well, we try to get that information ahead of time. It's part of our our scheduling form is, do you have ISRCs? Give us proper CD text, information, proper capitalization and punctuation, all that kind of stuff. Because you don't want to be, sending this off for pressing and then finding out that when you get the pressing back that, we didn't want any capitals on it or something,
right.
So by all means, get that information ahead of time. It's kind of almost a little bit, part of the mastering process is making everybody start, thinking seriously about their product. And it's like, oh yeah, song titles. Is that the title? I don't know. We're still thinking. All right, well, just let us know when you've got that figured out,
All right, so some of that data, if that data went to you, some of it is going to show up on a CD and some of it is going to show up on an MP3 for online streaming?
Right. We'll embed ISRCs onto, all WAV files, and we'll put as much metadata into the MP3s as is reasonable. I mean, it's really not a big deal for us to put all that information in, but you can change it yourself anyway from an MP3 standpoint. You'd have a hard time finding the software, I think, to be able to embed your ISRCs. Right. But
I probably should have started with this. I should have led with this, but what in the world is an ISRC?
International Standard Recording Code. It was a number that was invented years ago that was used quite widely in Europe for tracking radio play. The United States never really adopted it, so it kind of sat by the sidelines. But now, obviously, it's like a fingerprint. It's a part of the process of tracking your song's playability, its purchasing, all of that online stuff. You have to have an ISRC. Your digital distributor will put one on there for you if you don't have them. Then they'll probably charge you for them. So,
and it lives in a WAV file and it lives in an MP3, or just in one of the two?
You can put it, yes, in both. You can, you can put it anywhere you want it within the metadata for your MP3s as well. There's a spot for it, but there's only one place for it in a WAV file. I don't know in particular, I guess maybe the Sonara software that we use automatically embeds them into it. I'm not really sure. Right. I think they make I think they make a standalone ISRC editor for WAV files. Probably as mixing engineers, you might want to start thinking about embedding those in. We can see them too as they pop up for us if you're sending them embedded into the WAV files. But we normally try to get that information on a metadata sheet ahead of time.
And so, not to put you on the spot, but where do we go to get an ISRC code to deliver them to you before?
Oh wow! Is it ISRC.org? US ISRC.org in the United States? There's a different organization that for different territories. So you'll have to check within your territory for it. I would just Google ISRC numbers, and find out. As
I recall, because again, I don't do this regularly, have to deal with ISRC codes, but I think you do just go to their website and then you enter in song titles and it spits out a code which you can use. And I don't remember if it costs money or not.
Does.
It does cost money. Well, there you go. Now we know it costs money.
And quite frankly, you can use your digital distributor to assign those. There's no real benefit. It's not like you make more money by having your own codes. If you're an artist, get serious about it. Sign up to have a registrant code. Yeah.
If you are using CD Baby, for example, they probably have that built into the process of uploading stuff to them.
Yeah, and then they can provide that for you. Because I think it's for an album might be about $150 between getting the registrant code and then the numbers you're going to need. It might be about $150 or something like that. So, whereas maybe it would only be $30 or $40 through CD Baby, and if it's your first release, it doesn't matter. It doesn't give anybody else really any rights to your music. It's just a number so you can track your sales and your playability.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars, Alan Douches. Rockstars, if you want to check out the full episode, just go to rsrockstars.com/92. And you can find all the show notes there with links to everything we're talking about. If you want to go directly to go download the metadata sheet that Alan talks about and shares with you on the episode, you can go to rsrockstars.com/metadata, METADATA, and go download this sheet. It's going to explain everything you need to know about ISRC codes. It's going to tell you what kind of data you need to gather from the artist to make sure that when you arrive at the mastering stage, you've got everything you need. This is important stuff. It's kind of a pain in the butt. Alan's made it real easy for us by creating this metadata sheet for us. So thank you very much, Alan. And let's take it away to the next rock star. All right, clocking in at number 6. This was an exciting episode for me. This was one of my production heroes coming up through school. Episode 95 with Brad Wood. Brad is known for producing Liz Phair, Exile in Guyville. He's produced Veruca Salt. He's worked with Smashing Pumpkins, and he shares a lot of these stories on the full episode with us. He's got some great quotes to share with us. And I dig right in with this question in the outtake here. How do you create a great rock recording? So stand by. Brad, take it away. Let's learn some things about rock guitars and making a great sounding record. Cheers.
The first mistake you can make with most artists is to take the instrument out of their hands and give it to somebody else. That's a huge mistake. I have never in my career hired a session musician to come in and play a part that a member of the band was supposed to play. Deciding to abandon that person's performance and hire someone else to do it, you just fucked the talent.
Let's talk about rock for a second. One of the things that I noticed right away, especially when Veruca Salt came out, Brad, just so you know, I was a kid, 23, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, when Exile in Guyville appeared, when Veruca Salt came out, and these records really were meaningful to me, and to see your name on both of them too, I was like, oh, that's cool as shit, So, but one of the things is, the guitars just rocked. I mean, these were examples of how you make an indie rock band sound killer. So can you talk a little bit about recording the guitars on that? And also, touch on this topic of making something loud enough, because loud enough back then might be a totally different meaning than loud enough today. And what does that mean to you?
Well, to the first part of your question, guitars. I'm a jazz guy, or I was a jazz guy, and I didn't listen to any rock at all. Maybe just what was on the radio. I bought some 45s, but I was a snob initially and thought that rock was a lesser art form. And it really was The Who that turned me around. I had a next door neighbor that gave me a copy of Who's Next.
Nice.
For a birthday. It had been out for a while, but man, that knocked me on my ass. And I played it over and over again. And I remember saying to my mom one night, she came home early from work, and I was cranking The Who on the family stereo, not in my basement bedroom. And I was embarrassed, and I said, I'm just experimenting, Mom, with rock music. Don't worry. And she was sort of like confused why whoa, what's okay.
This is gateway music, young Brad.
She didn't care, but I felt compelled, to let her know that my studies with jazz and classical will continue unabated, Mother.
That's great.
But I was completely obsessed with that. And then the Tommy soundtrack came out for the movie, and I fell in love with that as well. And then shortly after that, I discovered The Clash, and all hell broke loose.
Joe Strummer.
And AC/DC. Dirty Deeds followed up by Highway to Hell. So, but I was kind of a late bloomer. All of that happened because I got into skateboarding, and I was looking for music to skateboard to, and meeting kids in the neighborhood, at this point, a new neighborhood. And we had built some ramps, and we had, a stereo, and we looked for stuff to listen to. We'd listen to anything that rocked that would get your blood going. And so that included Tom Petty, Ted Nugent. I hate to admit it. God.
Zuango Zitango.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Terrible stuff.
Sorry, I got to reference one of the greatest album titles, though. Intensities in 10 Cities.
10 Cities. Yeah. Dude, what an idiot that guy. He was dumb right from the get-go. And by 1978, I was starting to go to rock shows. But to answer your question, guitars. I also loved the first Boston album, an amazing sounding record.
Yeah.
And those guitars are just big, big, big. But in my mind, I didn't discriminate between a song by Boston, the right kind of song, or a song by Ted Nugent, or Cheap Trick, or the Buzzcocks, or the Clash. It was or Devo, for that matter. All of it served one purpose at the time, which was it got me excited to skateboard. And I built a half pipe in my backyard, and we did cassette tapes of stuff that would get you psyched to skate. And eventually the punk rock started to overtake, the classic rock. And eventually it was all new wave and punk rock with healthy doses of Highway to Hell thrown in there, and always Cheap Trick. And what I noticed then was just how loud the guitars were, especially Highway to Hell. I have to say, I think for most of the guitar rock I record for 30 years, I still use Highway to Hell and Back in Black as my gold standard.
Nice.
For panning, for the sound, especially Highway to Hell. The song Highway to Hell specifically, if you listen to the intro guitars, it's a close mic. There's a little bit of probably a plate reverb in there, but there's a lot of room mic as well. And at least to my ears, it sounds like there's room mic. And that's the sound of Marshalls just, screaming away, nice and loud. And I reference all the time to this day. And a lot of my references are from that era. I think we're all susceptible to it when we're children into our early teens. Music matters more to you perhaps then than any other time. And the stuff that really affected me as far as rock music was really guitar heavy stuff. And even though I love synth rock and I'm a jazz guy, my job mostly these days for almost 30 years has been to record loud guitars.
Thank you so much for joining us, Brad Wood, on Recording Studio Rockstars. If you want to go check out the full episode, Rockstars, just go to rsrockstars.com/95 and you can hear the full episode with Brad Wood. It was a totally amazing episode. I absolutely loved it. It was one of our highest downloads, and that clearly is a reflection of how much you guys enjoyed it too. So go check it out. Let's jump into the next one here. All right, coming in at number 5, right up the middle here. Actually, we're one beyond the middle. But this was episode 64, and it was the first time I got to have a real great chat with Mr. Warren Huart of Produce Like a Pro. So Warren actually just recently met, too, here at the 2017 Summer NAMM event here in Nashville. Great guy, a lot of fun to talk to. He's got a real well-spoken dude, and he was just as much fun to meet in person as it was to do an interview with him on the podcast, too. So join us for this outtake where I ask Warren all about how to get the perfect rock snare sound. So I think this is a killer topic. He gave a fantastic answer and shared some stuff with us. For example, you're going to find out why the most used and rented snare drum in the 90s is maybe not actually the drum you want to use for your next rock recording. Take it away, Warren Huart. Cheers.
Everybody's the same. A singer is a singer. They're just as demanding, whether they're Steven Tyler. Love you, Steven, but it doesn't matter if it's Steven Tyler or, you know, Steve from down the street. Everybody, they're singers, and they want their mix to be perfect. And they want to be inspired, and that's just the way it is.
Question I wanted to ask you about drums is I know for me, a typical struggle is recording a big drum kit, trying to go for a big sound, and then I put the guitars on and I go into mix and things are starting to get really kind of loud, and that's the point at which I discover that the snare is somehow doesn't have that excitement that is needed for a big track. Are there any directions that people might need to know about as far as, you know, you might want to start with a metal snare versus a wood snare, or, you know, does everybody need to just make sure they've got a Black Beauty handy or something like that? Any tips about making sure that your snare is sort of exciting by the time you get to mix?
Yeah, you touched on a bunch of different things there. For me, you know, I'm friends with Ross Garfield, and, you know, he's the drum doctor, and we were talking about this recently, and he says that his most recorded snare, bearing in mind, you know, he did the drums from anything from like Nevermind to, you know, Tom Petty's biggest records, Wildflowers and stuff like that. He said the one that he gets asked for mainly is a Black Beauty. So that kind of underscores what you were just talking about there. However, for me, that's the 90s snare.
Mm-hmm.
The snare that I most love and I use 99% of the time is a supraphonic. That to me is a little bit more useful. Now, we can have drummers listen to this and they can all disagree with me, and that's absolutely fine. Please disagree with me. But a supraphonic is to me my favorite snare. I mean, that's what you would consider. It's like the Ringo, the Stones, early Bonham. You know, that's the snare people were using. It became the Black Beauty and then became very prevalent in the 90s because people wanted just a little bit more aggression out of the snare. So to touch on what you're saying, if you want a more aggressive sound, you can definitely start with that sort of, you know, that brass kind of sounding Black Beauty. However, the snare I've had the most love with has been my supraphonic. That's How to Save a Life by the Phair. You know, that snare sound, that's a supraphonic. The whole of the last Aerosmith record, maybe except for one track, was my supraphonic. As much as Joey would throw up all these different snares, that ended up being the snare. The tracks that I cut on Ace's last 2 records, I ended up cutting like 3 or 4 songs on both records, were done in my little studio with the supraphonic. It's been that same snare. Any record, when I cut the drums on James Blunt, that same supraphonic. It's just like, I can make it, I can detune it, and I can use it and get that kind of puffy jet snare, that kind of snare.
Right.
Or I can tune it up and get some more aggressive stuff out of it. But the other thing I like about it, between you and me, is it's very forgiving with drummers. The thing about the Black Beauty is it is an amazing snare with a really good drummer.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something about that, it's just this extra projection and the potential ring that it has that doesn't always work with every drummer. For me, where a supraphonic you can pick up for, I don't know, you can pick up used ones for, you know, beaten up ones like mine for like $100 or up to $250 used. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
But if I was gun to my head to say one thing in all of drums that I personally would always bring to every session and always do, it's always that snare drum. And I've had Victor Indrizzo, I've had Blair Sinter, I've had all the different LA session players shoot out, and 75% of the time we end up with that crappy old beaten up snare. And I'm I'm not one of those guys that is like vintage. It's really important.
Right.
It's a 1971. I think it is a 71, but I think they've been, I mean, drummers will know, but I think they've been making that same snare the same way for time immemorial. It's not special by any means. It's not better than another particular snare drum of that ilk, of that period. It just really, it's the most one. If that's the thing I would say, if you're going to ask me what's the thing that I use on every drums that I like and always gets me the results, it's that. And I think having one of those in your arsenal is great. I have a Black Beauty and I also have an Acrolite as well. So I run the gamut with the with Ludwig, and I love Ludwig snares, but I usually just come back to that. It does the job. It's very forgiving with different drummers. And I think that's probably, as an engineer primarily, that's the kind of gear that you want. Gear that kind of, when you've got more money than sense and you can have, a 1073, a 312, a this pre, a that pre, great. But, when you're when you're talking about buying choice pieces of equipment and only, narrowing it down to one thing, for drums, for me, it would be a Supraphonic snare above anything else. I think would get you any genre pretty much that you want to do.
I think that's great. And I'm so glad I asked. And I think the rock stars are going to flip out to hear this part of the podcast because I love it. Despite our intentions to, steer people away from thinking there's a secret right answer to anything, it's still a lot of fun to hear for the first time, especially if you didn't know much about snares and you hear something like that. It's exciting. You go check it out. You're like, what's a Supraphonic? And you go look it up online. Rockstars, Google it, go to the music store, ask to play one, go hit it, see what it sounds like.
Yeah, and I know it sounds ridiculous the way I kept over enunciating it, but yeah, it's SUPRA phonic. So it's Supraphonic.
Right. Awesome. Thank you so much, Warren, for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. Once again, Rockstars, you can see the full podcast episode if you go to rsrockstars.com/64 and listen to everything Warren Huart shares with us. There's also a link in the show notes that'll take you directly to Produce Like a Pro, which is his site that teaches you in-depth courses about recording music. Lots of great content there. Thank you again, Warren, for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. Let's jump in and find out who's at number 4. All right, we're jumping in for number 4, and this one comes from episode 90, where we had Joe Costa, another great producer and engineer from Nashville, Tennessee, who's worked with the likes of Ben Folds. He's done a record with William Shatner, which he tells us about, which is just about as cool as it gets. And we jump right into a really great question, which I pulled from the episode. Each of these excerpts I'm doing is about 5 minutes. So this one is all about how to record great vocals. And I dig into some tough questions like, how do you know when you've got a good take or when it is time to just keep pushing somebody? Joe's going to give us his thoughts on all of that. Take it away, Joe.
There's a goofy story that I'll always remember. And I was in the control room by myself, but I don't remember what I was doing. I was in there and sitting there, and then Shatner comes in with a notepad. Right? He goes, Joe, we're going to get dinner. I'm taking the order.
Nice.
He said, now I've got 2 options here. I've got the Thai food or Baja Fresh. I only saw one episode of that series, Sound Breaking. I need to see the rest of them, but the episode I did see opened with Don Was, and I had to watch him and listen to this over and over again because it hit me so hard. So this is exactly what he said. So this is a quote. He said, in the studio, speakers are always situated across the back of the board, and there's like a speaker line, and really gifted people can jump across that line. And I just kind of went, oh my God. And I had to rewind it over and over again because not only is it so true, and he put it in such a great way, but for years I had always noticed working with a great vocalist, it always happened within a session. And you're doing vocals with someone who's a really cool vocalist, great artist and stuff. And maybe they're just trying to figure the song out and all that stuff. And so you may have 3 or 4 takes where it's like, yeah, that's good. Okay, that's cool. Yeah, that's probably usable. That's cool, And at some point, it's like the vocalist, artist in the speakers looks you directly in the eye and jumps up in 3-dimensional in front of that line. And I never thought of it as a line. I thought of it just as you're now jumping out of the speakers. Now it's on. Now we're getting some good takes. And it's like they kind of come alive and just engage you. Whereas the other takes in mentally, when I'm looking at the speakers, it's almost like they're kind of like looking down and kind of, even though everything might sound good and everything cool, but there's a one point where all of a sudden it just goes click. They look up at you in the speakers and all of a sudden they jump in front. And it's like, now you're coming out of the speakers.
That's really interesting. So two things come to mind about that. One is that there is a thing where you can talk about aiming the mic at different parts of a face and all that, but there's like an energy that can come from a vocalist. Hopefully I'm doing it right this second on this mic, where it's like you're just projecting your energy into the mic or through the mic.
Sure.
And it's almost like you can sound check a mic without headphones on. Sometimes you stand in front of it and you just, you can, I know it sounds crazy, but when you're communicating, it's right. It's like you're saying, you're sort of communicating through the microphone, through the speakers. And then on the other side, as the engineer, it's also that time in the takes where for those first takes, you're thinking about what you're supposed to be doing to the sound, right? As the engineer, you're like, oh, should I adjust that compressor? Oh, should I adjust that EQ? Maybe I'm doing it wrong, And then all of a sudden something happens and it's just right. And you're no longer thinking about adjusting things and trying to control it. You're now just observing, you're listening.
Right.
And you're engaged by the performance. And so what I always wonder about is when you're recording, and this particularly if you're producing, you're having to make decisions and give feedback, and you experience that vocal performance, that one take that engages you, what does that mean in the process? Does that mean we go, oh, that was great. That was really great. Why don't we do another one? Or does that mean we go, that was great. Should we try and beat that one and have a safety? Or does that mean we go, I was just engaged listening. That's kind of the goal of what I'm doing when I'm recording. So we're there.
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways you can do it. I think the way I would probably do it is, you just get excited about that and you hold on to it and you make a note about it. Maybe there's another take that goes beyond that, and then you've seen it where all of a sudden it's just like, oh, it just fell off. That's it.
Yeah,
like
you're on the wrong side of the hill now.
The spirit guides have stopped communicating. Whatever it is, and
mustache is drooping.
Mustache is shaved. Yeah, it's not happening anymore. And then it's like, man, that one just came alive. But we've always. I used to say that to Ben all the time. It's like, man, after the first few takes, that take 4, man, you started coming out of the speakers. That's just the way I put it. Like, because that's the way it felt like. Now you're actually coming out of the speakers instead of just having a performance. Yeah. And when I heard Don Was say that, I was like, that's exactly what I've been experiencing. He just said it in a cooler way,
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe Costa, for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. If you want to go check out the full episode, go to rsrockstars.com/90. And that again is with Joe Costa. He talks about recording Ben Folds, William Shatner, and a whole bunch of other artists. And he digs into everything from some great, hilarious stories from the studio to things you need to know about getting better sounding drums, tracks, vocals, mixes, the whole deal. So go check that out. Thanks again, Joe, for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. Let's jump in and find out who's at 3. It's a magic number. All right, Rockstars, coming in at number 3. We're getting near the end here. This one was a recent episode I did, actually. This is with Cristofer Odqvist, who joined us from Sweden. And he shares with us a really great breakdown of 7 studio concepts for a better record from his book, Making Sound. Cristofer is a regular writer for the Pro Audio Files, so he's got tons and tons of great content. And in this outtake from his episode, he digs into a great question of how to create really cool reverb effects in a mix. We're going to talk about using impulse response reverbs. We're going to talk about using real room sounds and also how to add more realism to your drum machines. So stay tuned for Cristofer Odqvist. Thanks again for listening. Let's take it away.
I'm using the Fatso compressor sometimes as a warm filter, like a dynamic high frequency limiter. So I can go into that and just boost the high end and I just push it back down. And so I pretty much end up with what I had frequency wise, but it's a different color. It's a different density, and I really like doing that. The stuff was his way of using like real spaces, like reverb, to enhance the other like digital artificial sort of reverbs. His philosophy is that if you have a real space in the mix, the brain will sort of connect to that, and the other reverbs will sort of they will be perceived as real spaces too. And I don't know if that's true all the time, but it's definitely something that I think works pretty well most of the time. And so I've done that more than a couple of times. Just put your monitor somewhere in a room that you think might sound cool, and put a microphone somewhere else in the room, and just start moving the microphone or microphones, if you want, stereo image and monitors around to try to get a bit of to get a good ambience.
So this is like reamping your sounds through studio monitors out in the big room, and then remiking that.
Yeah, I guess that's how they did, like, what they do in chamber reverbs. They have a speaker in there and a microphone. And like some people swear by recording in bathrooms, stairwells can be really cool for like a really long reverb. So that's really cool. And I've done impulse response recordings, and that's cool too. But it doesn't sound as alive and real as actually recording a real room. So
and recording a real room is actually such an easy thing to do, really, isn't it? Now, would you do it? Let's say you recorded drums in a space. Would you set a pair of speakers out where the drums are and reamp those drums one more time in that room? I mean, would you use the same sort of medium, small space that you already recorded everything in, or do you feel like it needs to be a new and different space most of the time?
I've never done that. I've always done it in a different space, oftentimes a larger one. But I've done it actually mostly, I think, for drum machines and stuff like that I think needed a bit of realism. But you can definitely do. I know some people use like big PAs for the drums and record those to get like a really big sound. So there's a number of ways to do it.
So Rockstars, I'm going to throw an idea out at you too, because if we're working out of our home studios, for example, and we've sort of got the spaces we've got, but don't feel like that limits you. So for example, if you took a laptop and a small interface and a single speaker with you, a self-powered speaker, and then I guess you'd need power. So that's the only tricky thing. But you went to some building where they had a big echoey room or just interesting spaces. If you could just plug in and run a mic out there and sort of play tracks through the speaker and just re-record them. You have to be quiet and don't talk while it's happening. But that would be an easy way to just go collect ambient sounds to put back into your record later, which could be a really effective and cool way to do it, and fun.
Yeah, that's what it's about. I think some things you do, they might not matter that much in the end in the mix, but if it's fun, it's gonna give you energy to keep going, and I think it's gonna serve the song or the mix or production well if you have a good time, if you can experiment, and absolutely.
I like that. All right, cool. So what else?
What else? I like gates for reverb, and not really the old 80s snare gated reverb, but for lead instruments like synths or lead guitar, vocals, I like putting insert a gate before the reverb. So you can either let the dry signal open up the gate, and then you get like a really big sound, but as soon as the note stops, there's silent, there's no reverb. So you don't get the sense that it's really sort of far back. It's not like it's in a big room, because the brain doesn't hear the tail. So it doesn't interpret the sound as being in a big room, but it sounds really big. And
okay, so we're talking about putting the gate after the reverb, but triggering the gate by the dry guitar.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, if you put the gate before the reverb and you play the guitar, don't you still hear the tail of the reverb afterwards?
Oh, yeah, you're right. Sorry. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you have to put it after the reverb.
Right.
That's true.
But it's cool. And I like the idea of maybe putting one before the reverb where maybe the quieter notes don't have reverb. And when you dig in and smack on the guitar chord, all of a sudden it opens up and you get a reverb hit too. So that could be a cool effect.
That's another sound. Yeah. No, that's good that you pointed that out. You need to put it after the reverb, but yeah.
But you would put the gate after the reverb.
Yeah.
But you would side chain the gate with the guitar the dry guitar from before the reverb, so that when you play the guitar note on and off, that gate will open up on and off, and so it'll let the reverb through at max, but then it'll go away really quickly.
Exactly, yeah. And you can do the opposite too. Like you switch the gate, so the dry signal will close the gate, so it's open all the time, and then when something is played or sung, the gate closes.
Ooh, I like that one. That sounds like fun.
That's a really cool effect, because you get sort of like a pumping reverb tail, because there's no reverb while the vocals or synth or whatever is playing, and so it's really up front, but then you get this tail that sort of comes up between the notes. It's a really cool effect.
Thank you once again to Cristofer Odqvist from the Pro Audiophiles for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. If you want to check out the full podcast episode, Rockstars, go to rsrockstars.com/91. And again, Chris is going to share his full 7 studio concepts for a better record from his book, Making Sound. Not only that, but he's also shared with us, and I was able to create a free giveaway for you at rsrockstars.com/making sound with no space in there. And if you go there, you're going to get a free excerpt straight from his book with a whole bunch of great tips in it. You can check it out, see what you think. If you decide you want to get the full book, there's a link in there. You can just go pick it up on Amazon, but it's got a bunch of great free stuff in there. So go check it out. Thank you again, Cristofer. Thank you, Pro Audiophiles, and shout out to you, Dan Camarchero. Rockstars, we're going to jump in. We're getting close to the end here. Here comes numero dos. All right, coming in at number 2. We're almost at the finish line. This one is from episode 84, where I had my guest Kevin Killen onto the show. Kevin has done a ton of amazing stuff. He just won a Grammy for Best Record of the Year in 2017 for David Bowie Black Star. He's recorded Peter Gabriel, U2, David Bowie, Yo-Yo Ma, tons of records. He talks about his experience first seeing the inside of a recording studio and how it looks like the Starship Enterprise. Then he digs into a topic that I think we're all familiar with, which is the concept of less is more. He talks about how experiences taught him this lesson over and over again. He also shares some great stories about working with Glyn Johns in the studio. So stand by for Kevin Killen. Take it away, Kevin. Thank you very much.
Literally the first day I walked into the control room, I felt like I was standing on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, and it kind of made sense to me, because it brought together all my various interests. You know, it brought in the science, it brought in the engineering, it brought in the technical, and it brought in the musical. And I thought, oh, this is where I need to be, and clearly I could hear well.
Well, I always notice that as we learn how to do stuff and we hear things, the more we know, the more obvious things are to us. But before we learned it and knew it, it wasn't obvious. There was no way you could do it until you go through that process of learning.
Absolutely. And in fact, you know, I think if I think of my workflow now, I use less processing now than I ever have done when I was a young engineer. I probably used too many microphones when I started out, too much EQ, too much compression compared to what I would do now. And it's not because I'm lazy. It's because I understand, you know, mic placement better, gain structure better, you know, the environment in which we're working in better. All those things have been accumulated over time, and, you know, witnessing what other people do and talking to other engineers who I admire, and eventually arriving at a consensus that I think, oh yeah, you don't always necessarily need to reach for, you know, this piece of gear or that piece of gear. You often make the best record you can in the environment you find yourself in, and you know, you can't be worried about, oh, I don't have my favorite piece of gear. So what? You know, if you got a 57 and a great sounding mic pre, you can make a great sounding record.
That's great. Okay, so now how about sharing a recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something that the Rockstars could take to their studio today on their next project?
Mic gain structure. That was something I learned from Glyn Johns. So when we were working on Stevie's record, he showed me that on that Neve console, stepped gain on the mic pre, and he would bring it up. You'd make the mic pre really hot, and then when you heard the first instance of distortion, you would back it off 2 clicks. So that would give you anywhere between 10 and 12 dB of headroom, and then you would adjust the level on the fader to the tape machine or to the DAW. And his viewpoint and his experience that had been born out at that point for almost 25 years or 30 years of recording when we worked together was centered around the notion that if the microphone was really kind of hot and sensitive, it would pick up all the wonderful nuances of the instrument. And that's something that I've learned from him that I've employed ever since, just making sure that gain structure is correct in the beginning. And if it is, chances are you probably won't need to use a lot of EQ, and you probably won't need to use a lot of compression.
That's great. It is such a true thing. There is this concept that things that are louder sound more appealing to us. In the mastering stage, you sort of learn that not to be fooled by that if you just simply turned it up, it would also sound louder. But somehow in the mic pre stage, you really do have to get it just loud enough for the mic pre to actually sound the best.
Correct.
You know?
Yeah. And then the other thing I learned a couple of years later, we're working with Burt Bacharach on this Elvis Costello record, was his ability to be able to come in with a fully formed arrangement on day one of tracking. And then for the rest of the project, he's actually removing parts of the arrangement and stripping it back down, which is contrary to the way most of us think about making records. It's like you think about, okay, we just keep adding stuff to it. And he was more about taking stuff away to create the space for which that particular motif or that particular line stood out and made you want to listen in a little bit more and made you want to hear it again and yearn for that thing again. I mean, it was such a wonderful experience. And also with him, when we went to mix, he was the first person I worked with where the vocal went up first and then the piano or whatever the main harmonic instrument was that was supporting the vocal. Because as he maintained, and it is absolutely correct, when you're dealing with a vocal intensive artist, the vocal is actually telling the story. So why wouldn't you start with that and create the space? So that was back in 96. And so 20 years later, that's how I approach mixing now. I always start with the vocal and bring in the main melodic instrument. And then usually the last thing I put in are the drums. And I'm a drummer and I love drums, but I totally get the space. I used to build my mixes from drums up. Now I do it the other way around.
Well, I'm still trying to learn how to do it the other way around. Drums are just so much fun as an engineer.
Yeah, it's true.
So speaking of vocals, it reminds me, listening to Black Star, there was a great thing you did where you could just hear David on the microphone getting ready to sing. And it's really, you hear like the kind of shuffling around and the breathing. And was that sort of a really intentional move? I don't remember. I apologize for not having written down which song it was.
I don't remember. I don't remember off the top of my head which one it was. But David went out and tracked with the band. So literally, the band would come in every day. We knew what songs we were trying to capture that day. They would literally go out and do one pass. He would listen in the control room, and the usual was wonderful. And then he would go out, and they were literally all in the same room. The Magic Shop was not a very large studio. I mean, wonderful sounding room, but not a very large recording space. So they were all live in the room. David was on a SM7 and maybe about 10 feet from the drums.
Wow.
And so, part of that is just that whole ambience, that, the spill between the instruments. And, David elevated the band's playing and the players elevated David's performance, and they really fed off of each other. So, we were in record, before they picked up their instruments. So there's probably just something about that particular moment that appealed to everybody. We just left it in.
Yeah. Well, and that's what's cool about it. I mean, it's one of those moves where first assumption is, I better clean up the vocal track before the singing actually starts. But,
right.
You chose the opposite, which is not only am I going to leave it in, but I'm going to make it this featured intro to the song. At least that's the way it struck me.
Well, that's really more kudos to Tony Visconti and Tom Elmhurst, because they ultimately mixed the record. I did all the tracking and David and Tony redid some vocals towards the end of the process. But
that's great.
Yeah. But pretty much the record sounds, the finished record sounds very much like the tracked record, maybe with a little more detail and a little more ambience and stuff, and they did a great job.
That's cool. That was so awesome. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. And once again, Rockstars, if you want to go check out the full episode, just go to rsrockstars.com/84, and you can hear the full episode with Kevin Killen. He talks about working with Peter Gabriel. He talks about working with U2, David Bowie, and recording Yo-Yo Ma. He's got a ton of experience in the studio. He shares all that with us, and it's a really inspiring episode. It's time to find out what the number one podcast episode out of 100 episodes of Recording Studio Rockstars is. Is the suspense killing you yet? Because it's kind of killing me. Rockstars clocking in at number one, the fastest podcast on the face of the planet. No, number one for the most listens and downloads of any episode out of all 100 is episode 78 with my very good friend Steve Albini from Electrical Audio in Chicago. He has recorded so many records. There's no possible way to list them all here, but some of the ones that you would be familiar with would be the Pixies, Smashing Pumpkins, Nirvana, just so many records. I had the great honor of working with Steve up at Electrical Audio and actually spending months there at a time when I was working with the band Living Things and Atrixo before that. We stayed in the dormitories there. I learned a great deal about what it means to have a recording studio, what it means to bring people on, whether you're training them or working with them in your studio, how to run a studio as efficiently and as professionally as possible. And I'm just thrilled to have him here on Recording Studio Rockstars. It's a perfect pinnacle for this show, and I'm really excited to share with you this outtake from my interview with Steve Albini, where we talk about one of the very important things in recording, which is how to get great drum sounds. Steve is a guy who's recorded Dave Grohl with Nirvana. He's recorded more great drummers than you can possibly imagine. And he shares with us the very importance of doing very little when you're recording drums. So stand by for the top most listened to and downloaded episode of Recording Studio Rockstars. Steve Albini, #1. Thanks so much, Rockstars, for listening. And we'll see you guys at the end. Cheers.
Like if you walk into a room and there's a beautiful naked woman laying on the bed, that's going to have an immediate impact on you. Whereas if you walk into a room and like technicians bring in like a really good leg and then one really good buttock and then and then they start stitching it all together, that's not going to have the same effect on you, you know?
Maybe if you're Frankenstein, it would. Well, so Steve, let's keep talking about your setup. Your drum sounds are really remarkable. You know, I think that's something that I can hear across many records you've done. And when I listen to your latest Shellac record, I still hear it. It's got the snare is just huge. And just tell us a little bit more about how it sounded to me like you were in center field, which is the big room for the drums.
The drums for the last Shellac record, the drums were recorded in the Kentucky room, which is the central room in that studio.
Okay.
The guitar and bass amplifiers were in the center field, which is the big room.
And I remember when we recorded with you, we really loved the sound of drums in Kentucky as well. So that makes sense.
Yeah, that room was designed to have a very bright, very quick reflection, but also to have an extended low end rather than a reverberant low end. Like there's a construction detail where the room is vented into the room in the basement, and that acts as a Helmholtz resonator and makes the bass response of that room go down flatter down to lower frequencies. But the reflective part of the room operates more at mid and high frequencies, so you get a bright reflection or reverb in the room, but the low frequency response of the room is extended, so it doesn't sound boxy and small.
Yeah. For those of us who don't always understand the tech, is that sort of saying the same thing as it lets the lows sort of escape?
Yeah. In a small room, a traditional problem with acoustics in a small room is that the low frequencies fold back into the room and cause cancellation. Like certain frequencies will peak and certain frequencies will dip because there will be modes in the room that cause certain frequencies to reinforce or cancel. If you have a larger room, then the low frequencies don't fold back on themselves until after a longer period. So you get a longer wavelength, which translates into a lower frequency before you start to get this reflecting and cancellation, right?
Right.
So for low frequencies, you get a flatter room by having the room be physically larger. And a way that you can cheat that is by having a vent or a port in the room that allows low frequencies to use more air volume, and that effectively makes the room larger for low frequencies. The high frequencies are still going to be rattling around in the room. The mid and high frequencies are still going to be reflecting off the walls and floor and stuff. But the low frequencies act more like a pressure wave, and that pressure wave then can dissipate through the port or through the vent into the other airspace.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same principle as, I mean, it functions in a similar way to venting a speaker cabinet to lower the resonant frequency of the speaker cabinet.
So a question for you, though. I mean, you did some remarkable design decisions in the studio. For example, the walls, I believe you made out of large Adobe bricks.
Yeah.
You did this vented Helmholtz thing down into the basement below Kentucky. And then if I'm remembering, the name of the dead room is coming back to me just now. I think you call it Alcatraz? Yeah, that's right. It's just coming back. And that's probably good because I built one here in my studio and I realized that calling it a dead room and telling people, hey, I built a dead room in my converted garage is just not the kind of thing you really want to lead with.
Yeah, when I say dead, I don't mean corpse. You just have to clear that up with people. That's all.
So, but Alcatraz, you did some really interesting things with sort of resonant panels, I think, right?
Yeah, if you go to the Electrical Audio website, there's a little cross section of the wall and in Alcatraz, and it explains there's a membrane absorber, which is a continuous panel that's hung from the ceiling rafters so that it's free to move. And that goes all the way around the perimeter of Alcatraz. And what that does is it flexes very slightly and absorbs low frequency energy. Now that room is also vented into the basement, so you get an extended low frequency response, but we also wanted to try to absorb low frequencies, and that's what the membrane absorber does.
And the membrane is sort of, it's held at the top and the bottom, or it's just dangling?
It's just dangling. It's like a curtain made of half-inch oriented strand board.
Interesting. Wow. All right, rock stars. Thank you to Steve Albini for being on Recording Studio Rockstars with us. If you want to go check out the full episode that I did with him, which again was the most listened to, most downloaded episode on Recording Studio Rockstars, just go to rsrockstars.com/78. You can check out the whole thing right there. It's full of fantastic insights into recording, running a studio, how to deal with people, answering the phone. I'll let you guys find out what that's all about when you go listen. Also, I want to remind you that, of course, I'm including links to all these different episodes. All top 10 episodes will be found in the show notes for this 100th episode. So if you want to just simply go to one place, find all the links to all these great episodes, just go to rsrockstars.com/100, episode 100. And if you're on your iPhone or you're on your Android device listening in with your podcasting app, again, you can just click through with your finger. You should be able to see the show notes right there in the podcast player, and you can click through with your finger to go directly to any one of these episodes and check them out. Or just grab the number and just go back and check them all out. Hey, if you haven't listened to all 100 episodes of Recording Studio Rockstars, it's not too late for you to go do that now. It's never too late. And a reminder that if you enjoyed this episode or you enjoyed any of the Recording Studio Rockstars, the very best way for us to keep growing that audience and bringing on more rock stars into our awesome clubhouse here is for you to share it. Share it on social media, send it to a friend, tell another friend about it. Any way that you can help spread the word is a great way for us to build our audience and help more people make their best record ever. So thanks again for listening. You rock. I'm just glad to be part of your world. Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.